Welcome to the AMATIC 2018 webinar series. My name is Julie Gunkelman. I'm the Professional Development Coordinator for AMATIC, and I'll be your host for today's webinar, Language and Mathematics, with Judith Moschkovich and Richard Barwell. Please note that the views expressed by the presenter are not necessarily the views of AMATIC. Commercial products mentioned by the presenters are not endorsed by AMATIC. McGraw-Hill is our sponsor of our webinar series again this year. Thank you very much, McGraw-Hill. I'd like to read a short biography about each of our presenters, and then I'll be turning it right over to them. Judith is a professor of mathematics education in the Education Department of the University of California, Santa Cruz. Her research focuses on mathematical thinking and learning, mathematical discourse, and bilingual, multilingual mathematics learners. Richard is Dean and Professor at the Faculty of Education, University of Ottawa, Canada. His research focuses on language, languages, and discourse in mathematics education. He was educated in the UK and moved to the University of Ottawa in 2006. So without further ado, I'd like to turn this right over to Judith and Richard.
All right. Let me make sure people can see me. I know you could hear a funny voice with no face. Hello, everybody. And Richard, you can, we hope you can see both of us. So welcome, everybody. We're very happy to be here. Thank you. What I want to keep calling AMATIC, but now I've learned is pronounced AMATIC, for sponsoring and organizing this. You'll be hearing from both Richard and myself, and we'll be switching back and forth. We hope that makes it even more interesting. Oops, give me a second. There we go. So this is an overview of what the webinar will be about today. We're going to do just a few more short introductions, so you know a little bit more about us. Then we'll have a little bit of background on who are English learners. We're going to focus on a couple of myths about math and language. And at the end, we'll have a little bit of time to go into principles and strategies for teaching. We do want you to know that in terms of resources and references, those will be provided after the webinar online for you. And I did want to mention that one of the reasons Richard and I are doing this together is that we were two of the authors for a recent review of the literature that is titled Language Diversity in Mathematics, Second Language, Bilingual and Multilingual Learners. It appeared in the Compendium for Research in Mathematics Education, edited by Jinfa Kai and published by NCTM. So we're going to go to Richard now for his introduction.
Hello. Hello. I'm very pleased to be here, and I'm Richard. I work, as Julie said, at the University of Ottawa in the capital of Canada. University of Ottawa is a bilingual university, so I work in a faculty that trains teachers for English medium schools and for French medium schools. As Julie said, a lot of my research is about language and language diversity in mathematics classrooms. And that's something I first got interested in as a mathematics teacher in Pakistan, where I taught children in English. And for most of the children I taught, English was their third or fourth language. It was a very multilingual context. And ever since then, that was in the 1990s, ever since that point, I've been fascinated by the role of language in the teaching and learning of mathematics. And on a personal note, I'm part of a bilingual household myself. My two boys go to school in French. We speak English and French at home. My wife is bilingual. And so this is something that is also part of my personal experience, particularly when I'm helping my boys with their math homework. Judith.
Thanks. And as you've heard, I'm at the University of California, Santa Cruz. Before doing my PhD work in math education, I taught college math at San Francisco State University for many years. And you've heard about what my research focuses on. I want to clarify that my training is in the learning sciences and my area of expertise is in math education. I'm not an expert on linguistics, bilingual education, or language acquisition, and we're going to make this point later on, is that we depend on experts in ESL, bilingualism, and sociolinguistics for insights and research on language. I'd like to make that distinction up front. And then I do want to mention that all of my research since I've started, since my PhD, has been with populations of Latino students in the US, mostly in California, some in Arizona, some in New York, and some in the area of Boston, Massachusetts. Spanish is my first language. My family and I immigrated. I always say they brought me to the US from Argentina when I was 14. And next, we'd like to hear a little bit about who you are.
So go ahead, don't be shy, fill in your answer. I'll give you a few seconds here. About half of you have voted so far. Okay, we just about have everybody for how familiar you are with language issues in the math classroom. So it looks like we've got about 23% are very familiar. 46% are somewhat familiar here. We've got a little bit at 19% and not at all at 12%. The second poll is, which grade levels are you most familiar to you? Kindergarten through second grade, third through fifth, sixth through eighth, 9th through 12th. Oops, I forgot to hit relaunch polling. My bad. That's why no one's voting. So it's K through 2, third grade through fifth grade, 6 through 8, 9 through 12, 13 through 14. And now you're voting like crazy. About 2/3 of you have voted already. I'll just give you a few more seconds here to get that done. Perfect. It looks like almost everybody has voted. All right, I'm going to go ahead and end that. It looks like the biggest group are the after the K-12. So you're at almost 50% there for grades 13 and 14. And then you've got a few here from K-2. We've got 4%, 13% from third and fifth grade through fifth grade. The middle school, about 15%, and about 19% from high school. And I forgot to share that. I can't read and hit buttons at the same time today. I'm so sorry about that. All right, there you go.
Okay, I think we're back to me. We're going to move to the next section, which is some background who are English learners. And we're going to also switch to Richard.
Thanks, Judy. So the poll results, before I get into this section, I think quite helpful. And perhaps just to kick off, I'll mention, we weren't sure who would be participating. So we've pitched this, I think, at people who have some experience. If you have a lot of experience, some of this may be a little familiar to you. But what our idea for the presentation is to share our take in terms of the practice of teaching math when ELs, English learners, are part of the classroom. We're sharing our take on this and how you can support English learners. And I hope that'll help you think about your own practice and your own ideas. And we'd of course love to hear from you during or after the presentation. And I think our examples, in terms of grade levels, our examples are pretty adaptable to a range of grade levels. And a lot of my own research is actually in elementary classrooms, but I've worked in high school classrooms and university classrooms. And Judith, I know, has worked across several different grade levels and at tertiary level as well. So let's get started with this section about who are English learners. So to start off, we want to mention that English learners is a kind of label. It's a kind of institutionalized label for learners who, in fact, are very diverse. They come from many different situations. They could be recent immigrants or even new arrivals. They could be students from established immigrant communities or established bilingual or multilingual communities. They could be students from indigenous, Native American backgrounds, or of course it could be, in some cases, a combination of these. So the point here is, an English learner is not one kind of thing. An English learner is a diverse category. And in fact, in some respects, we see the label as slightly problematic because it emphasizes the English part and kind of hides the fact that English learners, these children, are speakers of one or more other languages, which we see as a positive thing. And so we often use the word bilingual to highlight the fact that there are these other languages there as well, or multilingual. And if we want to pay attention to the fact that the children are learners of English, then we might say they're emergent bilinguals. And of course, some English learners institutionally get to stop being English learners. But one thing that research shows is to develop an academic level of English as a learner takes quite a long time. It can take 7-8 years to get to that level. And so many children who are no longer categorized as English learners may in fact still be developing their English proficiency at an academic level. So on the next slide, we have just a couple of kind of portraits of English learners in the United States. And so this map shows a proportion of English learners in different states. I'm not going to look at all the detail of this, but you can see high prevalence, particularly in the Southwest, California with the highest proportion, and quite high proportions in the majority of states. On the next slide, we have a list of the most common home languages. Spanish, perhaps not surprisingly, the most common home language, and then a variety of other languages. This is just a top 10, so there are, of course, many other languages with smaller numbers of students. And I got some numbers about the absolute numbers. So almost 4 million Spanish-speaking students, over 500,000 students from Asian backgrounds speaking different languages, 300,000 white English language learners, and 180,000 Black English language learners, and there are some other categories as well. And I think I want to reiterate that these numbers do not include children who maybe were once categorized as English learners, but are now not. So I suspect there are many, many more bilingual children who are not included in these statistics. Let's look at the next slide so that I can remember what it is. Oh yes, some final points in this section. So we just want to highlight language proficiency we see as distinct from math proficiency. It can be, unfortunately, when you're faced with a student who seems to be struggling to understand, it's often hard to tell, is that a language issue or a math issue? And it's important, although it's hard to do, and not to mix those up as much as possible. We want to highlight as well, language is not the only explanation for poor math performance, or indeed for good math performance. There are many other factors that intersect with language. And so to end this section, I encourage all practitioners to think about these kinds of questions as they work with English learners. Who are the students in your class? Going back to the idea they're very diverse. What languages do they speak? What are their backgrounds? What are their previous experiences? Many English learners have studied math in another language. So what are their previous experiences? Okay, so Judith is going to lead us into the next section.
All right, so we've framed this as a sort of overview of 5 myths about English learners and math that we thought come up often and that we may have held ourselves, that we find conversations center around that may actually be contradicted, or we're going to see how these fair when we look at research in terms of these myths. So here are the sort of the myths that we selected, and I'm just going to read through them. Often we have heard phrases that English learners cannot, and then you can fill in the blanks, succeed in math, participate in discussions, work with word problems, etc. Another myth is that there's no language in math, and Richard will address that with the first example we have. Another myth is that it's just about vocabulary. All that English learners need to do is learn the math vocabulary, and again, Richard will address that in the first example. The fourth myth is that using two languages to learn math is bad, and we'll have a short video clip to focus on that myth. And the last one is that precision, which many of you might be familiar with from the Common Core math practices. Precision is mainly about using the exact word. I'll address that again in the second example. So I'll turn it over to Richard now, who's going to talk a little bit about myths, I think 1 and 2.
Yes, thank you. So as Judy said, the first myth is that English learners are not able to do a bunch of things. In particular, especially when you meet maybe someone who's hardly speaks any English, how can they possibly succeed in math? But in fact, if we go to the next slide, research shows that there is a kind of relationship between language proficiency and math performance, but it's quite a complex and interesting relationship. So there's quite a bit of research showing that bilinguals outperform monolingual children in maths on average, but there's some conditions that go with that. So bilinguals who have a high level of proficiency in 2 or more languages are the ones that are most likely to outperform children in maths. So that means using language at an academic level, literate, and so on. What we might call emergent bilinguals who have high level of proficiency in one of the languages they speak usually have a performance similar to monolingual children. The interesting thing about this finding is it doesn't actually matter which of the 2 or more languages the child has their academic proficiency in. So children who come to school with an academic level in their home language can pretty quickly catch up and perform just as well as their monolingual classmates. And if they develop their English over time, so it becomes also at an academic level, then their performance may well start to outstrip monolingual classmates. Finally, there are some children where proficiency would be lower than monolingual children, and these would be emergent bilinguals who have low level of academic proficiency in any of the languages they speak. And that's not really surprising. We know even for monolingual children, if their language is not developed in an academic sense, they are also likely to struggle a bit, which is why we pay so much attention to language in school in general. So if we move to the next slide, we have some more findings about another aspect of children's participation in math class as English learners. And again, we may intuitively think, gosh, children can't really speak English, how can they join in? But in fact, there is a lot of research showing different ways that children can participate productively in math class, particularly in discussions, working with other classmates, and so on. But again, there are some conditions which make this more likely to work. For example, if children are working on tasks or situations that they recognize that make sense to them, if discussion is encouraged and supported by the teacher, if they have time to think, to understand and prepare. So anyone who's learned a second language knows it takes a bit longer to get your ideas together and work out how to communicate them. And also if we work not just with text, pages and pages of text, but a wider range of other kind of ways of making meaning. Could be diagrams, materials, gestures, and various other things that we'll look at a bit more later in the webinar. So let's move on to the second and third myths. So the second myth, there's no language in math. And I've included here an image which, for me, illustrates that there's a lot of language in math. For those of you watching who do not read 13th century Arabic, you may recognize the diagram, but the rest of the text is likely to be difficult to interpret. You might guess from the diagram that it's about Pythagoras' theorem. It's actually Euclid's proof, turned into Arabic in the 13th century by a Persian mathematician, Al-Tusi. And I think it illustrates quite nicely that, you know, we need language to communicate, to reason, and to do math. It doesn't exist outside of language, particularly the more abstract you get when you're doing math that's not just an object or something you can tangibly hold or see. Language becomes essential. So on the next slide, please. Judith is working the slides for me. Thank you, Judith. So what is the language of math? So here's a little question for you. There's a math, it's actually an assessment item from the province of Ontario in Canada, where I work. It shows a pretty standard item. I'm not going to read it out, you can see it. But I have a question for you, and I'm going to pause for a few seconds while you think about it. So the question is, what aspects of language do you think English language learners might need to be familiar with to engage in a discussion about this problem? I can see someone's, Tina, has chatted in definitions, so area, circle, radius. Thank you, Tina. So I think I'm going to move on. So in the next slide, I've highlighted some different language features. Oh, Curtis has suggested interpretation of the decimal point. There's a whole bunch of responses. I can't read them all, but it's terrific. I'm scanning them fast. Conditional sentences, question format, absolutely, right. So here's some that I noted. Some of them I can see in the chat, but some of them not. So I've highlighted the word the, very basic word in English, but for me here, the indicates not that it's the only formula. Of course, there are many area formulas, but that this is a kind of canonical important formula, a standard formula. So there's a subtlety about the word the. The word a, the area of a circle, indicates generality. The capital A for area, of course, if you don't know the word in English is area, the A might be rather mysterious. As somebody said, the word if, it makes a conditional sentence, so that's a grammatically and syntactically complex, more complex form. The abbreviation for centimeters, cm, people might not know how to read that or what it stands for. The following I've highlighted because it's an unusual kind, well, not unusual, but it's a tricky kind of reference to something that's coming up in the sentence. In this case, it's the four options. But when you read the following, you have to realize, okay, it's referring to something I haven't got to yet. Closest, so from a class of words, comparative words, so we have close, closer, closest. So the est part, you need to understand what that means. And it could also be ambiguous for some children who might think closest in terms of the physical distance between the formula and the answers, for example. And finally, its area. This is another kind of internal reference. This time, its refers back to the circle that is introduced in the first sentence. So it's a reference back to an object that was created earlier in the formulation. So on the next slide, to kind of generalize a little bit, here's some different aspects of the language of math. It's not an exhaustive list, and I can see in the chat box that you've thought of several of these and a few more. So vocabulary, of course, is important, but also logical connectives like if, and, because, and then, and many others. Sentence structure, somebody chatted that one in, so definitions, explanations, questions, test items, word problems. These are all different kind of structures or genres, linguists would say, language. Deixis, these are these pointing words like the following, or it's, or this, or that. Interpreting and connecting relating text to graphic or diagrams. So if the test item had a picture with it, you'd have to maybe make connections between those. Reading out formulae, somebody's just chatted that one in. So I've actually done tasks where I teach Anglophones in math in French, so they get to know what it feels like, and they can often manage, if they know a bit of French, until they get to a formula or an algebraic expression, and then they're stumped because they don't know how to read them out. And finally, participating in math discussion. So oral language is different from written language, and so there are other issues that come up there. So, see where I'm up to. That's the end of the first 3 minutes. So Judith's now going to take us through the next 2.
All right. So I've been waiting to cough. Thank you, Richard. We'll be looking at myths 4 and 5, using 2 languages to learn math, or in general, there are beliefs about mixing up 2 languages out in many different cultures and societies, that it's a reflection of not knowing something, either the language or the mathematics. So linguists have told us, in fact, that in general, whether we call it code switching, translanguaging, mixing up 2 languages, is not something that reflects any kind of deficiency. What I'll look at specifically is how that's not something that is necessarily bad in math. And the second myth, which is near and close to my heart, because I was a math instructor for a long time and probably held this one myself, is that precision may not always be about using the exact word. To illustrate and get you into thinking about these 2 myths, I'm going to use a little video clip from a very long time ago. You'll see how old it is. It's about 2 girls who are in they're doing an interview after school. They're in a 9th grade classroom. They've been in a mainstream English-only mathematics classrooms for several years. One of the students in this example had some previous math instruction in Spanish. And what we're going to do is join them in this interview after school. They're working on comparing lines using some very old graphing software. You'll see it. And they've done some previous problems. What I'd like you to do is take a few minutes to think about the problem on the next slide before we go and look at the video clip. Oh, and by the way, you do have the problem, focus questions, and a list of math practices and the transcript if you receive the handout by email. If you didn't, don't worry. We're going to look at this slowly with the focus questions, the math practices, and the transcript. If you'd like to look into this example further, the analysis is in this book by NCTM, Focus on High School Mathematics, and it's available for NCTM. It's a really great book. It's focusing on reasoning and sense making for all students. So you will have, you'll be able to look at that. So here's the problem. If you change the equation y equals x to y equals negative 0.6x, how would the line change? Their options are the steepness would change, why or why not. Would it be steeper or less steep? So these 2 young women drew the 2 lines on the right. I reproduced that for you. Again, I'm going to go quiet for a couple of minutes, let you think about. Again, they had worked, you see this is problem 8. They had worked on lines that had positive slopes and slopes greater than 1 before this. I'm going to take this opportunity to cough myself out.
Judy, were you going to play the video now?
No, I'm just giving people time to think about the problem for a second.
Okay.
So I'm just being quiet. Sorry.
Okay. No, that's fine, because there was a question if they should be doing something. That's all.
No. Think about the problem.
Okay.
I'll start talking again. So I designed these problems. It was a study that I did very early on in my career after years of teaching mathematics. And I thought I was a pretty good math instructor. You know, I was trained by amazing people at San Francisco State. So what I did is I designed these problems, and before having students work on the problems, I did what I think pretty much any good math instructor would do. I talked with them about, I introduced the word steeper and less steep. I did ask them to only record a response if they both agreed on this, because I wanted them to discuss and talk, not just have individual responses. I gave them a few examples on the board. You might see them, but you look really closely on the board, of lines that were steeper or less steep than each other, or not. And I asked them to give me a few examples of lines that were steeper and less steep. And I thought, yay, I've done my job. I've introduced the vocabulary, and I'm good, right? I'm a good instructor. I've done what I needed to do. And among the many things I learned from the study, one of them was that although I had done that, students were amazing. They needed time, and they showed me in their discussions that they needed to sort out and make sense of the meaning of all of these words with the representation. So I just wanted to mention that before we move to watching the video clip. Now, I'm going to ask you to watch a video clip, and I do this for any video. I would never show you a video and just say, what do you see? Because we would then be here for a long time. I would like you to focus on what are the math practices that you see, and what are the resources that students use. One of the reasons that I ask you to do that is because I'd like you to focus on the mathematical, what makes the conversation, the discussion mathematical, and I do that by focusing on mathematical practices. The other question comes from shifting, if one of those myths is that English learners cannot do blank, is shifting from a deficit view to an asset view. And by looking at resources, I'm asking you to do that. So again, the first question is about, what's the mathematics that's going on here? And I think of that as mathematical practices. The second one is about resources. You're gonna have to listen and watch carefully. There will be subtitles. When one of the students speaks Spanish, the translation is gonna be below in parentheses. Also, don't worry if you don't get it when you first watch a video. Most people don't. I will read the transcript slowly after showing the video clip. Just as a review, here are the, oh my goodness, the numbers don't match up, but that's okay, right? This always happens with PowerPoint. These are the 8 Common Core math practices. The ones in blue are the ones I'd like you to focus on: making sense of problems, reasoning abstractly, constructing viable arguments, and then the last one will be attending to precision. It's pretty funny. I always have trouble with counting and numbering, so I'm not surprised this happened on PowerPoint. And now we cross our fingers and go to the video clip. What you have on the right is what the young women had drawn on their piece of paper.
No. Yes,
Sure?
yes.
How?
Yes, this one.
Real? You sure?
Look. Mira, qué pos. No.
Okay, let me see. Revisala, pues. Okay. No. It's less deeper.
Why?
You see? It's closer to the x-axis. Isn't it?
Oh, so if it's right here, it's
Porque
deeper,
fíjate,
right?
digamos que ese es el suelo. Entonces, si se acerca más, pues es menos difícil.
Oh, I got it. I thought you meant it. ¿Cuál es la diferencia entre esto y lo otro? You know what I mean?
Sí, pero fíjate.
But that's not what they want.
Yeah. Well, kind of. Que sí. this one está entre el medio de la X y de la Y, right? This one is closer to the X than the Y, so this one is less steep. So why don't you raise?
Okay, so I'm just going to again read this because I know the first time you hear this, it may not be exactly clear. So Marcela says, no, it's less steeper. Why? Marcela, see, it's closer to the x-axis, isn't it? Oh, so if it's right here, it's steeper, right? Marcela, porque fíjate, digamos que este es el suelo. In English, that's because, look, let's say that this is the ground. Entonces, si se acerca más, pues es menos steep. Then if it gets closer, then it's less steep. Oh, I got it. I thought you meant cuál es la diferencia entre esto y el otro. I know what I mean, which is the difference between this and that one. Marcela says, pero fíjate, but look. But that's not what they want. Marcela says, yeah, well, kind of, because this one is, está entre el medio de la X y de la Y, right? It's between the X and the Y. This one is closer to the X than to the Y. So this one is less steep. And in parentheses, I have put in what they meant to by this one. You might notice that many of the things that Richard went through show up in this transcript. And we could also do an analysis of this transcript looking at lots of dixes, lots of this one and that one that we have to think about. So again, back to the focus questions, I'm going to share with you the mathematical practices and the resources that I see in this short clip. Back to the math practices, I actually have a definition for making sense of problems from NCTM, understanding a situation, concept, or context by connecting it with existing knowledge, reason abstractly, drawing logical conclusions based on assumptions and definitions. So the first mathematical practices that I'd like to connect to, they're reflected in using phrases. So I want to say, if I hear students using something like if-then statements, which they are, to me that's a reflection of reasoning abstractly, which is math practice too. We also saw Marcela saying, let's say this is the ground, and that again is evidence of constructing arguments. If you have a general sense that this was going on, what I wanted to point out is that there are some phrases beyond vocabulary words that reflect those practices. And then I want to move next to attending to precision. So what I see Marcela doing is she was stating an assumption explicitly so that the claim was precise. It's very difficult to say whether something is steeper or less steep unless you know what is the reference. And she's done this by saying, digamos que este es el suelo. Entonces, let's say that this is the ground then. And she's also connecting a claim to the graph. Now, that might be so intuitive and so in our bones as math instructors that we forget about this. But if you start out teaching, even I want to say this, math majors who are going to be teaching, I have to remind them that our claims are always connected to multiple representations, and that although they may be in our imagination, it's important to make sure we connect those two explicitly. So what she's doing is using the axes as a reference to support a claim about the line, saying, está entre el medio de la X y de la Y, is between, excuse me, the X and the Y. Now, I want to make a couple of points. Many people, when we're faced with code switching, translanguaging, jump to the question, well, why did someone switch at a particular time to another language? I want to tell you that as a expert code switcher and translanguager myself, linguists tell us that there's many reasons why. Many of them are contextual and interpersonal and quite complicated, not necessarily cognitive. And so I'm going to just shift away from that question to instead going back to the mathematics. I want to make a point about precision. I'd like you to notice that in the example, precision was not about using a precise, I want to call it the perfect mathy word that would make a math instructor smile and be happy and jump up and down. but it's about making a precise claim that applies only under precise conditions. So I want to suggest that we need to consider Math Practice 6, Attentive Precision, particularly for English learners, but probably for all kids, as meaning more than using the precise word. And I want to think about how precision works in mathematical practices. My favorite example I know is from early on grades, but it's still really good. Many kids will make, and some adults might make the claim that multiplication makes the result bigger. And some people might say, ooh, I don't like result. I want that word to be product because that's the mathy word I really want. And then bigger, what does that mean? I'd like that to be a different word. If we're trying to support a mathematical discussion, again, it depends on what our goals are, we may want to focus on precision not at the word level, but at the claim level. So many math teachers would move to asking, okay, if you think that's your conjecture, when do you think multiplication makes the result bigger? And then we can have a conversation about, is it when it's a whole number larger than 1? And then really interesting conversations can happen around, well, what if the number is 0 or 1? Is that bigger or not bigger? That's a mathematical discussion where neither the teacher nor the students are focusing on the individual words and how precise they are. And lastly, I just want to help you notice, which you probably already did, the resources in this example. Digamos que este es el suelo. So she's using her first language for explaining and clarifying, not because she was missing a word that she didn't know in English. And she's also using everyday language and experiences. The x-axis is the ground, and get steeper, again, is a everyday way of saying something about slope. The conclusion is that using 2 languages can support a mathematical discussion in multiple ways. And just to review, for a summary of what does research say about these myths, English learners can succeed in math, participate in discussions, work with word problems, because you'll notice there were some words in that problem, in the right conditions. Myth 2, there's a lot of language in math. It's much more than vocabulary. We hope we've given you just a taste of that. And using 2 languages can support a mathematical discussion. And again, the last one is that precision matters at the claim level. And now we're going to switch to Richard, who's going to share some principles and strategies for teaching.
Thanks, yes. So in the last, I've got about 10 minutes left, I think. I'm going to look at, based on what we've just talked about, some principles for practice, in effect. And I have a couple of examples of some types of tasks that can be helpful. So the first principle I would propose, not a surprise based on what we've just said, but to avoid deficit assumptions. So as we've seen, English learners are capable of succeeding in math in the right conditions. So then the task is to work out, how to provide the best conditions possible. English learners bring a lot to the math classroom, and so another approach as a teacher is to work out how to make use of the richness that they bring to support their learning of math, and of English, I would add. The second principle I want to mention is when working with English learners to focus on their mathematical reasoning, as Judith, I think, has just illustrated, and on their mathematical practices, and not always get too hung up on whether they're using the right word. It's not that you're going to, ignore the vocabulary. Of course, it's important, but rather building from their expression of their mathematical thinking, and to work with that to get to a place where the mathematical language is something more academic in English, so the math language of English. But that focusing on that mathematical reasoning part is important. The next principle, Judith, can I have the next principle, please? Thank you. To make use of students' multiple resources that they bring. So we've seen quite a few examples already this afternoon. Different languages that they may know, their knowledge that they already have of maths and of mathematical language. I've worked with children, for example, who previously instructed in Chinese. And what was fascinating was when I worked with them on word problems in English, they clearly were familiar with the structure of a word problem, what a word problem was, even though doing them in English for the first time was a bit new. Can draw on their own experiences of the world, so things that are familiar to them, but they not just kind of the material aspects of their lives. I once asked a young elementary school student to write a word problem, and he wrote it about zombies in the morgue. So this is for him something very real and exciting, and so we came up with a word problem about zombies. Resources can include deixis, as we've already seen. In some cases, working with other students and drawing on their ideas and interpretations. That could be other English learners, but it could also be children more proficient in English, so working together. Different representations, symbols, gestures, writing, materials, graphs, diagrams, and so on and so on. And so these can provide, you know, a rich source of ways of making meaning in mathematics, not just relying on kind of words. And finally, different types of talk. English learners may be advancing in their English in different situations. Even if they're still working on their academic language, they may be able to do all kinds of creative things in English. For example, maybe in rapping with their friends, making Let's Play videos to put on YouTube, street talk, sports talk, all kinds of different ways that they talk. So an interesting question is, you know, how can you use some of these ways of talk that they develop in English or in multiple languages, in fact? How can we use those to connect with math? And the point I want to make about all these resources is there's a richness there, a repertoire of resources we can think of that English learners have. And so for me, the goal is how to expand these repertoires. So not to replace what they know already with formal mathematical language, but rather to expand the repertoire of resources they have to add in there math language in English. Informal math language, formal math language, written, spoken. But it's an expansion that connects with all these other things that they can do. So the last set of principles are about math instruction that pays attention to language. And these are all kind of connected. So firstly, ensure students have the opportunity to talk and write mathematical language. So this comes from a ton of research in second language education, bilingual education, that learning a language it's about production. You have to use it. And in many math classrooms, it's often the case that children spend more time listening and reading than actually talking and writing. So if you want to help their English and math develop, they need opportunities to talk and write. So in terms of how you might go about that, next principle would be to include math language objectives as well as math objectives. So, you know, you're planning your unit or your lesson, you've got what you want the children to learn in math, but think about having some language objectives. Next principle, it's one I like a lot, is finding ways, can be challenging, but finding ways to combine language learning and math learning in the same activity in a deliberate way. Now that can sound a little bit of a challenge for a math teacher. Maybe think, oh, I'm not trained to do that. Well, there are people who are trained to do that. So I think it's important to work in partnership with people with the training in English as a second language education, or bilingual education, or English language development, or whatever. And so it's an important source of support, whether it's in your institution or using professional associations or online materials some of which we'll share with you later. So very quickly, some strategies for combining math and language, providing opportunities for students to talk about and write about mathematics is an important start. Listening to students' mathematical talk to make sense of it and supporting children to make sense. Posing questions to provoke more thinking, revoicing children's mathematical ideas, so feeding them back but reformulated in a more mathematically typical formulation. Drawing attention to the important mathematical ideas in what they're expressing, drawing attention to important mathematical language in what they're expressing. Not necessarily both those things at the same time, but when it's appropriate, noting, yeah, you used the math word there, that's great. So finally, if we move on to just very quickly some examples of possible task types. I've got a list here and I'll show you, I think, 3. These are just sketches. They're to give you just an idea of where you can go, but I do recommend you find people to work with to develop these kinds of activities. So these examples are based on a common problem on the next slide called towers. So towers made out of toothpicks. It's a sequence. What's the next tower look like? What is the nth tower? How many toothpicks does the nth tower have? So here are 3 quick sketches of tasks to go with that problem. The first one is a set of 4 sentences, and oh, the slide's gone funny, but never mind. 4 sentences, and they all have more than in the middle, and so students have to match the first part more than the second part. So tower 4 has 3 toothpicks more than tower 3. And so the idea is it's working both at the mathematical concept, which one is more than which one, but also at the language, this quite complex sentence structure using more than. And so you might get children to work on this in pairs and then read out their answers. So that's the production piece. You're supporting them to produce correct sentences, but then you get them to actually vocalize them. Next task is quite a simple one, matching phrases to a diagram. So this is that thing about connecting language and diagrams. So you have various labels, and the idea is to figure out how they fit on the diagram. So this is again connecting mathematical language, including not just vocabulary, but the word more is there as well, but connecting them into some kind of mathematical sense. And finally, writing frames, or they can be speaking frames. So this is for students who are a little bit more advanced in their language development, where you provide them kind of a way to organize text. So you provide what's in bold. I noticed that, I think that, because, and they fill in information. So this is helping them build the structure of a mathematical argument. You can do this for their writing, but actually you can also use this kind of technique for the speaking. So it's kind of scaffolding how they put together a mathematical argument. So as I say, those are just sketches of tasks. They need a bit of thinking about. It's easy to kind of not do them very well, so that they need a bit of care. They need to be linked to mathematical objectives and to language objectives, but there are plenty of sources of support to help develop those kinds of activities. So that's it for those examples. So I'm going to hand back to Judith to close things off, I think.
Okay, thanks, Richard. Online, we're going to provide some resources for teaching, again, 2 websites at least, Understanding Language and WIDA, W-I-D-A, some references for things that you can read that are about research and or more practitioner oriented, as well as a PDF of the slides. I think it's now time to move into questions. And I think the way we're going to do this is if you, in the chat box, type your question. It'll take us a little bit of time to decide which questions to answer, how we'll go and answer, because we might think we can both answer, or we'll go one and then the other one. So we'll just do this with, I think, Julie's help. And if you see me looking away, it's because my chat box is over here on the left.
Yeah, I just asked them to put any questions in the Q&A box instead of the chat box. It's easier for us to keep track of. And we're kind of running out of time. We're getting close to the end. We've only got 3 minutes left, and I do have some kind of a little bit of wrap up here. So
can I make then one comment? Because I just did read through. People mentioned the decimal point and the comma as being things people need to pay attention to. Reading right to left. There's one study that found that did not influence mathematical performance, but those are all really interesting questions.
Okay. One question did just come into the question and answer box, and it is, what are some strategies for leveraging multiple languages in one classroom?
Do you want to tackle that one?
I can throw one out straight off the top of my head. Is how about having kids write problems of their own in their own languages, and then producing an English version of the same problem and presenting those. That kind of approach positions the speakers of these languages as experts in their own language, so it's quite empowering, but it also works across with the mathematics and the connection to English. That's just one off the top of my head.
Another one that I've collected is being thoughtful about when and for what goals to organize groups. For example, all the kids who speak Spanish in one group, or all the kids who speak another language in one group, and when to mix up the languages, because sometimes it will be good to have students translate for each other, and other times it'll be good to mix that up so that they will have to use English with each other before they, in their small groups, before they speak to the whole class. So again, that's another strategy for mixing up the multiple languages.
Right. It does look like there's some more questions. I don't know if you guys can stay on the line. If I could do the wrap up, and then maybe you could stay on and answer a few of the questions that are coming in. Is that okay?
For a few minutes.
Okay, for a few minutes. Let me go ahead and share my screen back. Let's see. There we go. Oh dear, it went right back to the beginning. I lost it here. I'm having problems today, I tell you. Okay, don't get dizzy, because I have to go through a few of these. Thank you so much for participating in today's webinar. If you'd like to support future AMATIC webinars, please consider becoming a member of AMATIC. You can go to bit.ly/join-AMATIC. We are on Facebook. The regions have Facebook groups as well. Please consider joining them. And maybe some of you found out about today's webinar on Facebook. Recordings of past AMATIC webinars can be found at bit.ly/AMATIC-webinars. It usually takes about a week or two to produce and upload webinars to this archive. Everyone who's in attendance of the webinar today will get notified when I have the recording and the materials available. Please take 2 minutes to evaluate the webinar content and the presenter. Again, we'll have them stay on the line for a few minutes. You can go to bit.ly/AMATIC74. You can scan the QR code, or I'm going to put the link in the chat window so you can just grab it from there. I'm going to end the recording right now, but again, we'll stay on the line.